Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Noah from the Marion Library Service, and welcome to our Library Through the Lens live webinar with special guest writer and publisher Lynette Washington in conversation with best-selling author Victoria Purman. Since the closure of our libraries and venues, we've been working hard to still connect and engage with you through our Library Through the Lens series of adult programs delivered differently. We had to reimagine how to bring you the author talks and presentations that you've grown to expect from us. So thank you for joining us today. This evening, Lynette will talk about her newly published book, Thrill Me, a collection of 35 stories designed to quicken the senses, written by award-winning and emerging writers from all over the country. Please feel free at any time during the presentation to type questions you have for Lynette into the Q&A text box on your screen, and later I will ask these for you. Now sit back, grab a cuppa or a wine, and welcome Lynette and Victoria.
Thanks to Tracy. Oh, I'm unmuted. Am I unmuted now, Tracy?
You are, sorry.
Oh, great, great. I just saw a message pop up. Hi, everyone, and thank you once again to Tracy and her team and Marion Libraries for just being so agile and pivoting to run these events during coronavirus and all the social restrictions that are in place. It's really appreciated by not only authors, I'm sure audiences too. And I just wanted to check, are you back open this week, Tracy?
We sure are. So we opened our libraries, the Marion Libraries, from Wednesday. So we do have limited opening hours, 9:30 till 5, just throughout the week, Monday to Friday, and restrictions on the numbers. But everybody that's been coming through our doors is super excited to see us back. So yeah.
That's great news. And it must have been really difficult in that interim period, as it has been for a whole lot of people.
It was.
But I'm going to get to Lynette Washington now. I'm just going to tell you all, for those who are listening in and don't know Lynette or know bits about Lynette and not the whole story, here's the whole story. She's a writer, editor, manuscript assessor and teacher of creative and professional writing. Her stories have been published widely and performed at events such as Spineless Wonders Presents and Court Short literary readings. In 2014, she edited the story collection Breaking Beauty. In 2017, she co-edited the story collection Crush, which I read, which was amazing. Plane Tree Drive, her debut, was published in 2017 and was highly commended in the 2018 Victorian Premier's Literary Award and was shortlisted for the MUBA. Can you fill us in on what that is, Lynette? What's the MUBA?
The MUBA is the most underrated book award, and it's an award that's given by the Small Press Network. So it's for books that are published by small presses that maybe didn't get all the publicity and marketing budget that a larger book would have got.
Ah, gotcha. A worthwhile thing to be nominated for, I think.
Yeah.
From 2014 to 2017, she was the editor and submissions editor at Midnight Sun Publishing. When she's not writing and doing all those other things, she teaches police cadets the importance of sentence structure. I wish we had time to talk about that, because that would be fascinating. She holds a PhD in creative writing from the Uni of Adelaide. She's been a panellist at a whole range of festivals and continues to teach and write and practice. Welcome, Lynette. I'm going to applaud. People at home. Thank you, Victoria. Before we get into talking about Thrill Me and this latest short story collection, I wanted to talk to you a little bit. You're an editor, but you're also a writer. How have you found writing during coronavirus restrictions?
My writing practice is dysfunctional at the best of times. And these are not the best of times. And, on paper, this looks like the perfect time to be writing because, theoretically, all of our outside activities have kind of, been condensed into nothing, or inside activities. And so we have all this extra time on our hands. But I think the way that's actually played out for me and for lots of other writers that I know is that has not equaled writing time. There's been something strange that's happened for me personally, which is where I've kind of taken my foot off the pedal and I feel like I've really taken it off. I've been on a treadmill for a really long time where I've been working really hard at lots of different things and being extremely driven. And this just kind of stopped everything in its tracks, and that included my writing. So I haven't written a creative word since this happened. and I don't expect that I will again for some time. And I think that's okay. You know, I think a lot of writers are sort of feeling disappointed in themselves for not being able to write at the moment, but so many of us just can't. There's too much processing going on, don't you think?
I totally agree. I've written words, but I don't think any of them are any good. I mean, it's so hard to be. The side effects of the coronavirus social restrictions have been there've been a couple of deaths in my family, and one is a really, really close friend, and that whole process of not being able to grieve in the way we might normally has really made this whole experience kind of surreal and strange and feel weirder than it already does. And that just takes so much thinking time and brain space, I think, away from any creative practice when you're just trying to get through the day without really taking a really good, deep, dark look at where we are as a society and as a world, because that you might not come out of that rabbit hole for a while.
I agree. And I think, but I think we will come out of the rabbit hole, and when we do, it's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to see what writers make of this, because I know some writers at the moment who write in a sort of dystopian or science fiction sort of genre are saying, oh, that story that I wrote, it's just come true, and now it doesn't feel like it's not dystopian, and it's not, you know, predictive of the future in any way anymore. It doesn't work in that genre. I've got to reimagine everything that I've been writing for the last 12 months. The world we live in has changed, and so the way we write has to change. And I think once we get the opportunity to sit back and take that breath that you're talking about, we'll all look at this world and try and figure it out and interpret it somehow through our writing.
So do you think there's going to be a sort of new genre of maybe Corona Lit or something, Co-Lit or Rona Lit? I don't know what acronym what shortening we might give it, but it is because it's a sort of 1 in 100 year thing. Do you think it'll be that influential on the writing practice and story that writers come up with?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I mean, if you look at those other events, those other 100-year events, they're still in our consciousness through the creative arts, aren't they? You know, the storytelling that happened post the plague, for example, that's embedded in our literary culture. And I think this will become embedded in our literary culture as well.
Maybe that's the next collection of short stories for Glimmer Press.
Maybe. We'll see.
I just, on that point about writers not struggling at the moment with motivation, I think is that I think the message is, if you haven't managed to make sourdough bread at home and knit jumpers for the whole family, please don't feel stressed, and just be for a while. So if you're a writer and you're watching this and you haven't written words, or you think they're rubbish, well, we all do most of the time, but just go easy on yourself and wait till it comes, right?
Absolutely, could not agree more. I've seen so many pictures of sourdough, and I'm not even attempting it. Good on you if you did. Congratulations, I love it. But no, I think we all need to cut ourselves some slack and understand that what we're going through is extraordinary. You know, I think as a parent, we think about the impact it's having on our children and their schooling and their education and their social interactions and all that sort of stuff. But actually, that's all happening to us too as adults. And so I think we do have to cut ourselves some slack and realise that we are going to come out of this. And maybe that will be the time to get back to, you know, our regular writing practice, whatever that might be.
Yeah, great advice. Okay, on to Thrill Me. We couldn't not have that conversation being writers about what's going on with our manuscripts. Can you tell me, I just want to go back a bit to Glimmer Press. Where did that idea come from, and why did you set that up, and why did you want to present short stories the way you have?
That's a big story, which I'll try and make short because it's probably not a very interesting story.
Oh, no, it's always interesting.
Well, you know, as a child, I was one of those people who loved books and loved reading and felt like I wanted to work in publishing from a really young age, and lived in Adelaide, and we had one publisher here, and, you know, the opportunities to work in publishing sort of didn't really exist. So I've had that desire from, you know, quite a young age, since I figured out that there were people who made these magnificent things called books. And, you know, very circuitous route to that, but eventually did start to work in publishing and worked for a number of years for Midnight Sun Publishing here in Adelaide. And just realised that, yeah, I did actually really love this, and decided to branch out on my own. And I had a manuscript for my lap, and I have it here. It's called To Rhyme or Not to Rhyme, and it's a book of children's poetry that's illustrated. And it's the kind of book that most publishers would go, well, that's unpublishable because nobody buys poetry, nobody buys children's poetry. But I thought it was just gorgeous and deserving of an audience. And so I offered to publish it. And yeah, that's when Glimmer Press came about as a result of this book. And it, you know, it has been a great success for us. It's
I think Kristen Martin is saying, "Yay, my book."
Yeah. Yes. Hi, Kristen.
So you have the dream, but how in practical terms, how do you make that a reality?
Yeah, it's a lot of trial and error, I suppose, figuring it out as I go. And luckily, Kristen, who wrote To Rhyme or Not to Rhyme, is a friend. So she was very understanding and forgiving as I was kind of telling her, look, I'm learning the ropes as I go. Because although I had worked for a publisher for you know, a good 4 years or so, I'd learned a certain part of the business, and all of a sudden I had to understand the whole business. So I had to know not only how to edit and market a book, but also what goes into printing a book and getting distribution for a book. And those were areas that I hadn't had any dealings with. So I've just kind of, you know, figured it out bit by bit. And in fact, one of the reasons why I wanted Thrill Me to be the second book that I published was that it was the work of multiple authors rather than one. I didn't want to take on someone's individual manuscript as my first sort of adult publication and mark it up. Because you and I know that when you write a book, you know, it might be 10 years worth of work, and it is your heart and soul, and it's your precious baby. And I didn't want to learn the ropes with someone's baby. So this way I got to learn the ropes with, you know, the excellent work of a lot of people, but it wasn't one person's individual manuscript, and it felt a safer way to do it. And I felt like I learned a lot of lessons doing that, and now I feel much more confident with the next step.
Do you approach things as an author or as an editor or as a publisher now?
Yeah, I think I wear all those hats because I do still write when I can, and I am working on a manuscript at the moment, not literally at the moment as we were just discussing, but you know, it's kind of there in the background. And I do edit the books that I publish. So I wear all those hats, and I really like that actually about being a small business operator. I like that I get to do lots of different things because I get bored doing the one thing over and over again. So that's the beautiful thing about publishing actually. Every book is different. You learn different lessons with every book that you publish. With Kristen's book, you know, that's an illustrated collection of poetry, and really it probably wasn't the greatest idea to publish an illustrated book first, because that's a whole different ball game. And I learned a lot about how to make an illustration work on the page.
Because that's getting the words right and then getting the pictures right as well, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And we had an amazing artist, Joanne Knott, who drew the images, but figuring out how to make that work through a printing process was the big lesson. How do you transfer something that's drawn on paper to a digital file that doesn't have any weird, you know, backgroundy stuff going on, and that works, you know, when it's printed? So I can't even remember how I got around to talking about that.
Oh, but, so how do you view the project as writer, editor, or publisher? So
Oh, yeah,
they're
a bit of everything.
they're indivisible, I
They
suppose,
are.
aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I can work with writers in a what I hope is a really productive and respectful way, because I've been there and I know what that's like. And so I understand, I've been in their shoes.
And it's a very weird spot to be in as an author, isn't it? When your deep dark heart and its secrets are judged by people in a range of ways over and over and over again. So it can be a vulnerable place, and it's great that you can appreciate that and respect that too. So how did you go? Where did the idea for Thrill Me come from, and how did you go about sourcing the stories? Did you put out a call? Did you approach writers you knew? What was that process?
I think the idea, it sort of came out of the blue a little bit for me, but I was thinking about what I thought people liked to read, and there's a huge section in a bookshop. Like if you walk into a bookshop and you look for the kind of crime, suspense, thriller section, it's a big section. So I thought, okay, that's something that people like to read. So that was my sort of slightly cynical, I guess, approach to it. What are people going to want to read? But then I'm also someone who likes to push the boundaries a little bit. So I didn't want it to be conventional. I wanted it to I wanted to see how far we could push the idea of what is a thriller, like we did with Crush, which, as you've read. We didn't want them to be conventional love stories. We wanted to tell the stories, tell romance stories in as many different ways as possible. So it's not stereotypical, and it's a bit, it's quite diverse. And I think this collection is the same. It's diverse, and it approaches that idea of a thriller from lots of different angles. There are some stories in there that are probably are more conventional. For example, they end in that kind of, with that plot twist where you go, wow, okay, didn't see that coming, and that's the moment. But a lot of them don't have that moment. They just sort of have this kind of underlying heartbeat behind them that's just a little bit quicker than maybe it should be. And so, it's a different kind of suspense. So that was what I really wanted to achieve with it. But also I have, one of my formative reading experiences was reading Stephen King as a young adult. It was the first time I felt like I was really making my own choices about what I read. And I was just enthralled by what he could do. The way he used the page, with changing fonts and leaving gaps, and the way he crafted stories that were just terrifying, but also made you think, because that's the other thing I was going for. I didn't want cheap thrills. I wanted stories that actually made you think about the ideas that are going on. So I think, that came from that early reading, that really formative reading experience of reading Stephen King as a young person.
Do you think he's looked on as kind of a pulp fiction in a sense by some? I mean, clearly he was influential to you for the reasons you've talked about, but he would be seen as really, really commercial fiction, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, he's had phenomenal
There's nothing
success.
wrong with that, of course.
No. We love successful commercial fiction. Nothing wrong with it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, his success is just phenomenal. And he's prolific. He's been doing this for so long, since the 70s, I think, and he's still producing writing. So, there are people that probably consider him pulp fiction, maybe commercial, definitely, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and if you can come up with a great plot twist, then it's a great plot twist, no matter what the cover looks like, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I talk to a lot of writers of literary fiction, and that's the area that I kind of write in myself. And so many of them will say that their favourite book about writing is his book called On Writing. Yeah. And it is, I think it's the best book about writing that I've ever read. So regardless of whether you think he's, you know, and in a dismissive way, think he's commercial or pulpy or whatever, even people who, you know, write literary fiction will recognise his capacity to understand how to write and what works in writing. So yeah, I think there's something special about him.
So is this a sort of a tribute to the thrill you got when you were reading those Stephen Kings as a young adult?
I think it is. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So how did you go about commissioning the stories? Did you approach the authors? I'm thinking if there are potential short story writers or emerging ones who are listening, they might want to know. It sounds like a great opportunity. How did you go about collecting the stories?
Yeah, great question. So I used as many different avenues as I could to reach out to people. So there were some people that I knew who I'd published previously in Crush or in Breaking Beauty, which was another collection that I worked on. And I approached them because I knew that they would create something that would be excellent. But mostly what I did was contact writers' centres and ask them to put the call out in their newsletter. So I contacted all the writers' centres around Australia and did that. Did lots of social media stuff and asked people to spread the word in their sort of writing communities.
Okay.
And it worked because we got people submitting from all over Australia. Lots of people that I knew, of course, but also lots of people that I didn't know. And so I guess if writers are thinking about how do I find out about these opportunities, there are various things you can do. And one of those things, of course, is to keep in touch with your local writers' centre, like Writers SA, who do have call-outs in their newsletters quite regularly, and also to follow publishers who do this kind of thing. So follow their social media, have a look at their websites, and do that sort of thing.
Do you want to give a shout out to your socials? So I know there's a website because I looked at it today, but are you on Instagram and Facebook and things? Twitter? Yeah,
so we have glimmerpress.com.au and we have Instagram, which I think is just at glimmerpress, or it might be at glimmer_press. And Facebook.
Search it, you'll find it. Yeah. What instruction did you give to the authors about? Did you know the title of the collection would be Thrill Me, or did you say you wanted it to be a thriller, or what was the direction?
Yeah, actually, the title was one of the first things that came to me. It came to me at the same time as the concept. So I had the title, and I just obviously there was a word limit, and I encouraged people to send me shorts as well, because I really love flash fiction. And there are a couple of stories in there that are really quite short, and they're fantastic. So we had an upper word limit of 3,000 words, and I just said, it has to have that moment where the reader's sort of heart skips a beat, or they take that little intake of breath. It has to have that moment in it somehow, some way, but don't stick to conventions of the thriller genre, whatever you think they might be, because we want to play with that and try and subvert it a little bit and see how far we can push those boundaries. And the other thing I was really clear about on the call out was that I was not interested in stories that sort of victimised women in a way that made them powerless. So I feel like that is a very tired and outdated concept in the sort of thriller genre. The idea that women are victims that are rescued by powerful, benevolent men. I didn't want that. So I really asked people to think about that when they were writing or submitting their stories. And I was, really, really happy with the stories that came in. We got quite a large number of submissions, and it was a really high standard. And some of them really actively subverted that sort of stereotype of powerless women.
Oh yeah.
Others, yeah. Yeah. Whenever I have this particular conversation, I always think of Melanie Kinsman's The Amazons, which is a story about women coming to the rescue of another woman who's in distress, or young girl actually, who's in distress. And that shows their power and their ability to look after someone. Yeah.
There's a standing joke in my house that whenever we watch a thriller that starts with a shot of a woman's dead naked body, I refuse to watch any further, because it is such a lazy trope, right? And I totally agree with you. And I figure if you were an actress, you'd say, guess what, Mum and Dad, I got my first part. What is it, love? Well, I'm playing a naked dead girl. I mean, it's just horrible.
Yes.
And it's lazy. And I totally agree with you on that point. And that I did love some of the, when I was first approached and you sent me the book, and I thought, I was expecting thrillers in that really traditional sense, but there were thrills in all kinds of ways, I thought, in the stories I read. That some of them, the characters were getting a thrill from what they were doing. Others, the thrill was in the reader, I thought. Sometimes the thrill was exhilarating, other times it was horrifying and really, really scary and terrifying for those characters. And in Rachel Mead's, I'm thinking about the thrill had gone in a way for that character, who's no spoiler, she's an ambulance officer, and that's the character's journey in that little vignette about how she used to feel the adrenaline rush of going to a car accident, but she's so inured now to the tragedy of those that she doesn't anymore. So that's what I really loved. And I can't think whose it was. I haven't, and the book's in the other room. The bull riding story. Right?
Yeah, that's the great one, isn't it?
It's just so really visceral about that process. And then you find out her motivation at the end. It's a real cracker, that one. As for so many.
Yeah, that's Brid Cummings. Yeah, it's
so
that's
it's not a suspenseful thriller, but the thrill she creates in that atmosphere of the rodeo. No, it's bull riding. Was really terrific, I thought, without singling anyone out. But that was one to me, and I read and I thought, actually, it's not the suspense it's not the thrill that I was expecting. Actually, it was something altogether different, and that was the beauty of getting to the end of so many of these and thinking what the thrill was. It's a bit like a puzzle trying to sort them out.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's not always obvious what the thrill is. Like you say, I think you've described that really beautifully, actually. And I think that with a collection like this, by its very nature, certain stories will be more impactful to certain people. And so everyone I've spoken to will point out a different story and say, wow, that was the one that really got me. And that's just the nature of something like this. But the beautiful thing about it is that you can have all these different experiences, and some you'll connect with more than others. But, you know, they give you an opportunity to experience a different way of, you know, reading in the genre in a little nutshell.
What is it structurally about a short story that makes it a short story? Aside from the length, but there are other things about them, aren't there?
That's the $1 million question. People write PhDs answering that question.
Sorry, you've got 2 minutes now.
I don't know if I can do it. You know, there are some people that argue very strongly that a short story has to contain everything that any other kind of longer piece will contain, but in a shorter, condensed form. So, you know, it's got to have the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's got to have the character development. It's got to have the climax and the resolution, and it's got to have all that stuff. But there are other people, particularly people who write in the flash fiction area, who will argue that actually it doesn't have to be any of those things. It can be just a vignette or a postcard type image even. So it depends very much on your view. But I think ultimately all stories have to have characters. or a character, and something has to happen to that character. It doesn't have to be something dramatic. I think that's where emerging writers or people who are learning the craft of writing sometimes stumble, is they feel that something huge has to happen. You know, there has to be a car chase or a death or
dead naked woman. Yeah,
the dead naked woman. But actually, it can be something incredibly subtle that happens to a person but changes them. And they're the stories that I really am drawn to, because I love those. I think that's quite often more what actually happens to us in our lives, isn't it? We have these little subtle things that happen to us, and maybe they all accumulate, or maybe they become a turning point on their own. But for most of us, that's how we go through our lives, and that's how things change us. So yeah, I think for me, they're the two essential criteria. There's got to be someone, and something has to happen to them. Beyond that, it's all up for grabs.
Yeah, true. I was just, as you were describing that, I was thinking about Amy T. Matthews' story. No spoiler, again, the opening line is, "There's a dead body." But the thrill in that story is really interesting too, and I just love the way she wrote that about what the thrill is. And every word, it was about, where is this going? I'm not sure. And it was that kind of, that kind of growing sense of unease, and she just spun it around beautifully, I thought, at the end. And that's and you know what I love about coronavirus reading, as a bit like coronavirus writing, that for people who are listening who might not have read many short stories, they're little bite-sized things you can read quickly, and you don't have to worry if you don't have time, or you're off baking your sourdough or knitting all those homemade jumpers for your children or whatever. You can kind of dip in and out, and there's no order to them, so you can kind of just open the book at any point, can't you?
Absolutely, yeah. And dare I say it, you can even skip ahead. You know, if you start reading a story, it's okay, you're allowed to do that. Not everything and not every story will appeal to everyone. And, you know, you can start reading, and if you don't like it, move on. That's all right.
Well, if you don't like it, read to the end. It's only 3,000 words.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And, you know, a lot of people tell me they're the perfect size to read just before bed, because you can have a whole contained world and in, you know, 10 pages or something, and that's your bedtime reading. And, next night you pick it up and there's a new one. So you don't have to have that continuity, and you can have a break from it if something else happens.
To people who are listening and who might not have read short stories before, and might be put off thinking that they're too literary, or they might not understand them, I really would encourage you to just have a read of some of these. They're just little, it's like you land in the middle of something happening, and you get a little, as you were saying, a little kind of a snapshot of that little point in time, which those writers have captured so beautifully. And again, Andrew Roff's is really beautifully structured about a train driver and some children, and as both story threads is the word I'm looking for, as both story threads sort of inexorably come to this conclusion, you just think, oh no. So it was, but it didn't need to be a novel to give you that that feeling of fear, actually, and horror.
Dread.
Yeah,
I think there's a feeling of dread for me in that one, because the reader knows it's happening. The reader actually sees it coming. You know what's going to happen,
yes,
or some version of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And you can't do anything about it. It's inevitable. And it's awful. And that is such an expertly crafted story.
Yeah.
I think it's so cleverly done. And the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking, Victoria, was that idea about how short stories are really concise. So if you think about, if you're used to reading a novel, you're used to, I guess, being eased into a story and reading, and there's always a bit of repetition in a novel. You know, you get told something several times. because you need to be reminded of it at various points over the course of the, 60,000 words or whatever. But with a short story, there's none of that. It's kind of wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. You are dropped in the middle of the action quite often. There's that idea of starting in the middle of something. And there are no wasted words because there's no space. So they're really tightly woven. And I just think it's an incredible art form, actually. And people who do it well, it's an amazing skill.
You're right. You don't have words to play with, do you? And they can be deceiving because they're so short. I mean, a bit in the same way, poetry can be deceiving because it can be 10 lines, but actually there's a lot of blood, sweat and tears in every word. And the same would have been the case with these writers in these short stories too. Yeah, I love Johnny's work. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, novelists always say how they think writing a short story is the hardest thing to do, and short story writers always say writing a novel is the hardest thing to do because they are quite different ways to write, and if you're used to one way of writing, it's hard to adjust to the other one. But you were about to talk about Johnny's works.
Oh my God, yes. I felt the sense of horror from about the very first paragraph in that one, I got to say. But I think he gets in the mind of an 8-year-old boy on the toilet. And it's wild. I have 3 sons myself, and I read that and went, oh God, that's just, I know what, and I sort of had that reaction too. So all these stories gave me something different, actually. And that's that lovely thing about the variety of them. What were you going to say about his story?
Oh, look, it's a lot of people actually have commented about that story because I think a lot of people find it quite relatable. And also there's just something so desperately sad about a kid who finds himself in that position and who feels they have no safe place to turn.
Yes.
And
that's where the horror kind of developed for me about that little boy. Oh.
Yeah, it's desperately sad. Yeah.
So what's next on the agenda for you?
Yeah, good question. I'm in the middle of editing a novel that will come out next year. It's a Melbourne-based writer, Christopher Hawkes, and it's called The Miscreants, and it's a story of 2 brothers who have a devastating event happen in their childhood, and that leads them both on certain paths that then have to intersect at some point for them to reconcile what happened to them. So that's really exciting. Christopher is an amazing writer. It'll be his first published novel, but he's a very, very special writer, and I think a lot of people are going to really enjoy his work. And I'm also working on a middle grade fiction novel for children, which is written by an Adelaide author called Helen Dinmore. She writes as Catherine Norton, and she's written a beautiful book, middle grade children's novel that I can't wait to publish. So they're the next.
What's that definition of middle grade for those who might not be sure?
Yeah, good question. So it's sort of that age group around sort of 7 to 10 years, but it's a bit flexible depending on, kids read differently at different stages. So it's the upper primary, I suppose you'd call it. Yeah.
And we were talking before about how people think it's easy to write a short story because there's only 3,000 words in the word limit for Thrill Me, but middle grade fiction and writing for children is even more complex, right?
It's so hard, and I think part of the reason is because you have to pitch it right. You have to get the right voice and appropriate tone and language for that age group, which is a really, really hard thing to do. and also, and picture books are the hardest. People think, oh, there's 500 words in a picture book, how hard can it be? But actually it's the hardest thing to write, and it is the hardest thing to get published because they are incredibly expensive to print. And so publishers don't like taking risks on them. So and kids see when something's not, genuine, or when it's an adult talking down to them, if it's condescending in any way, or if there's any of that kind of, this is a moral lesson you must learn, they're not interested in that. They want a story. They want a visual story.
I'm farting, come on.
Yeah. All those books about, my bum went berserk. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a moral message in a kid's book. I'm not saying that at all, but story has to come first, and kids see straight through that. So.
Sure. And do you have time to read? Is that what you've been doing in coronavirus world, where if you're not, we're all struggling to write? Are you reading?
Absolutely. That is what I'm doing a lot of. And I've been going through a real stage of reading Australian authors, and I do that quite intentionally because, especially at the moment, I'm aware of how hard it is for publishers. So, all the Australian authors, and there are many Australian authors who have had a book released in the last several months, all their usual avenues for promoting those books have just vanished into thin air. So publishers are doing it really hard, and writers are doing it really hard. And so I've made a real effort to go out and buy as many Australian authors as I can recently. And, I brought some show and tell.
Oh, please go.
These are the two that I've got going at the moment. So Gay Lynch actually has a story in Thrill Me as well, but this is her novel that has just come out, and I'm sort of, I'm only at the beginning, but oh my gosh, she is an exceptional writer. Her sentences are exquisite. This is historical fiction set in what's now Mount Gambier in South Australia, and sort of pioneering settling times, and the conflict between Irish migrants and Indigenous people in that area at that time, and also importantly the story of a young woman who needs more in her life than she gets from her really remote, barren existence, and so seeks out something. So that I'm absolutely adoring. And this one, and this is actually another author whose story is in Thrill Me.
Yeah. I just bought that the other day. That's in my pile too. Yeah.
I don't know if you can see the shimmer. How magnificent is this cover? Oh,
foil on a cover that's very special.
Yeah. So publishers
you can hold
know that when a publishing company invests in a cover as expensive and beautiful as this, it means they know they're onto a good thing. This is a good book. They're going to sell lots of books. So I haven't started this yet, but I have actually, I read an earlier draft, an earlier manuscript, and it's incredible.
And she's South Australian too?
Also South Australian, yeah. So this is a hot tip. I think this is going to be an incredible read, and Catherine's going to go places. This will be the first of many that we see from her. So, so that's what I'm reading at the moment.
Only two, come on.
Well, actually, the stack next to my bed, I couldn't bring the whole stack.
I know, and it's look, and your this collection of short stories, Thrill Me, was one of those victims of coronavirus as well. You were going to have a launch at a library. We love our libraries, but all that was postponed or cancelled actually. So and Catherine's book, Pick Williams' book, another Adelaide writer, Gay's obviously too. Rachel Mead's book release is coming up. It's just a hard time. I mean, it's a hard time for a whole lot of people out in the world. Let's not downplay that either, but it's a hard time for writers too, and publishers and our booksellers. So, yes, we should all go out and buy all the books or borrow them from the library.
Well said, yes.
Either or. Tracy, are you there? I think we have some questions. I'm just looking at the bottom of the screen. Do you want to pipe in with those?
So the first one is from Becky, and I do think that might be Becky from the owner of Shakespeare's Books. And she wants to know,
hi Becky.
Hi.
have you ever thought of writing children's books?
Oh, I'm a bit scared too. I don't know. My kids often say to me, when are you going to write something that I can read? And I actually, what I have tried to do and what I would love to do is to write a young adult book. I love reading young adult fiction, and I've just read Poppy's books that Wakefield have published. I'm just struggling to remember the titles. Sorry, they'll come to me.
Something about Evelyn Tate, taking down Evelyn Tate.
That's it, taking down Evelyn Tate, and Alice Dyson, making friends with Alice Dyson. Yeah. They're awesome. They're so good, and I would love to write in that genre. And if I could, I would. But it's really hard. Like we were saying before, it's so hard to pitch that right and to get a voice that young people can relate to. And yeah, I really admire people who can do that.
Great. Jennifer says she's just begun researching for novel number 3 that might test her voice in a short story first. What do you both think?
Fantastic idea. Actually, short stories, I'm assuming from that she hasn't had those novels published. So I reckon short stories are an excellent idea, because what you can do with a short story is get published in a publication like this, or or enter in a competition. There are always lots of short story competitions around, and you can start building your writer's resume. So I always like to think of your writing career as a job, and some of the things you can do are to participate in your industry, so networking and that sort of stuff, but also start building a resume. So that means start getting things published. And the easiest way to get something published is a short story, or to get recognition through a competition. So then when you start sending out your novel to publishers, you can say, brief comment in your cover letter, I won this short story competition, or this short story was published here. And it is also a really great way to hone the craft of writing, because you do have to pay attention to every word. You have to grab your reader really quickly. There are no kind of shortcuts, really. Do you agree, Victoria?
I absolutely agree, and I think when publishers look to, I speak from the commercial world, but when they look to publish you, that they look at, of course, the quality of your manuscript. Is there a market for it? Has anything like it been published before? They also want to know, can you get up and talk to people, because that's part of the industry. They also are very impressed if you have published before, because what it said is that you're committed to it. And that you've been edited, and that you have a track record, and people wanted to work with you, really. So it is. I absolutely agree. Don't think that if you're published in short stories, you might then get stuck there. For instance, it's all great experience, and it builds your reputation, but it builds your skill base as well. Yeah, highly recommend. And Lynette mentioned earlier, Writers SA. Connect with the writers' organisations like Writers SA if you're in Adelaide, and to go to workshops and pick people's brains and learn about what you're trying to write, and read lots as well. You'll learn a lot from reading other people's short stories, if that's where you want to go, or novels. But yeah,
great advice from 2 great writers. Who have we got? Rosemary. So she says her question's about editing, and particularly structural editing. How important is it to have some training to edit fiction or non-fiction long-length books?
I'm assuming that she's asking in relation to being able to edit her own work. Training, I mean, training helps because it can give you some tools and some structures and some processes. And like Victoria just said, I would always encourage people to continually aim to hone their craft, and it's a learning process all the time. Being a writer, you never suddenly know everything and stop learning. So yes, always engage in the process of learning and improving your craft. Do you need to study structural editing to be a writer? No, you don't. But what I think you do need to do in some way or other is to study the books that you like to read and therefore the books that you want to write. So one of the first things that I did when I was learning to write the long form novel form was I was going through a phase of reading a particular author who wrote lots of books that were basically carbon copies of one another. So she wrote in a particular genre, and there was a character that went through all these books, and the character just had a slightly different story each time. And it struck me that this was a formula that she was using to write these books. And I studied that formula and then tried to copy it. And in doing that, I learned the structure of how that particular type of book worked. So I guess I was teaching myself structure and structural editing in that process. So I think it's and that book will never be published. It wasn't particularly good. It was derivative and it was, all those sorts of things, but it was my learning process, and that was an extremely valuable thing to do. So yeah, I think study the books that you like to read and the book that you want to write is one way to do it. Victoria?
Yeah, look, I've worked with structural editors, and so I've been edited, but I've never worked as that kind of novel structural editor. I've worked as other kinds of editors, but you can overwhelm yourself with the rules about things. I think you can spend all your time reading craft books, but never actually write your own book. I'm not saying the participant is in this space. I would just say that learn some stuff so you don't spend 100,000 words really in the first act, but trust your story and trust your storytelling. And then when you go back to read it after you've let it aside and risen like that sourdough, then you might understand why it doesn't work. If you think, oh, this bit's soggy or this bit's boring, then if you go back to a structure, then you might understand why those things are. It's called the soggy middle a lot of the time. Why is my middle bit boring? Well, because you haven't actually set up a structure in the first act, maybe that creates things for your characters to do in the middle of the book, for example. So a bit of that is knowing about structure, but don't get overwhelmed and read all the craft books or borrow them all, because you'll never actually then start the book. So we're probably generalising a bit, but I hope some of that's helped.
Great. Julie wants to know whether you use a printer that's located here in South Australia.
For Glimmer Press, I haven't for the first two books, but I may for the next one. Yeah, at the moment I'm using a printer that's based interstate, still in Australia, but interstate. Yeah. It all comes down, unfortunately, to dollars. And I would love very much to support. We have a couple of printers here in this state, and I'd very much love to support them. And I am hoping to be able to do that in the near future.
Excellent. Julie says, I'm a poet. It sounds like I have Buckley's chance of publishing my manuscript. Let me know what you think about the chances of building an audience. I have the manuscript ready, 160 poems about many different subjects. Any hints for distribution outlets?
So I know I did say earlier that no one likes to publish poetry. That's not entirely true. Of course, I was generalising, and I was thinking more about the major publishers, the big publishers like, your Penguins and your Hachette and things like that. But there absolutely are small presses out there who specialise in publishing poetry. And Ginninderra in South Australia is one of them. Also, if you are in South Australia, Friendly Street Poets, I would highly recommend you get in touch with them. They publish, several anthologies every year. You can submit your manuscript, and it might be chosen to be published on its own, or it might be chosen to be published in conjunction with other poets. And there are lots of people out there who do publish poems and poetry. You can always look at publishing online as well. You could, so Kristen, who wrote this one, has a website, Kristen, I think it's Funny Poems for Children or Funny Poems for Kids. And she publishes a lot of her work on that. And that's been a really successful website, actually, which is referenced by the Children's University and various other people. So she gets a lot of traffic through there. And so there are lots of other avenues to getting your work read as well. It's not just always about print publishing. But one thing you might want to think about doing is having a look at the Small Press Network's website. The Small Press Network is an organisation that supports small publishers, and they have member publishers. So you can go onto their members page and have a look at who's a member of the Small Press Network. And that's just one way of finding lots of small publishers. And you can click on their logo and find out what they are interested in and what they specialise in. And you will find that there are some that are interested in poetry. So it's not dire straits. I'm sorry if I sounded like it was. There are definitely avenues and definitely ways to get your work read by people. So don't give up. Poetry is a beautiful and important thing. And there are a lot of people who are working really hard to get poetry published.
Becky Lucas is saying you can also submit to magazines. I'm sorry, I can't see the rest of that comment. I presume that you can also submit to magazines. Yes.
Yeah, great advice, Becky. What else have we got here? Oh, Alice Jackson. So she's asking, do you have any plans to publish picture books?
Sorry, Alice, no, not immediately. I said earlier that picture books are a huge investment for a publisher. They're extraordinarily expensive to publish. Most publishers in Australia can't afford to have them printed in Australia, so they get printed overseas, often in China. It's an expensive and complex process, so it's definitely not one that I'm looking at right now. As a really new publisher, I want to get established with the novels that I've got coming up, and a few other books that I've got on the cards before I look at something like that, because it's such a big investment. Sorry, Alice.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have there today. Unless you've got anything else, Victoria?
No, just thanks again to you. Well, actually, I do have a question for Lynette. Do you ever sleep?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, I try. No, I do sleep. I'm fine, really. I do get bored with just doing the same thing over and over. So I do like to, keep life interesting by working on different projects like this. But I do sleep.
Well, and one final question from me, Lynette. Do you ever read an author's work and say, damn, I wish I'd written that?
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh. All the time. All the time. In fact, I just read Almost a Mirror. I don't know if you've come across that one. Kirsten Krauth?
Oh, no, I haven't read it, no.
Oh my gosh, I read that and I really wish I'd written that. In fact, I have tried to write that book about 6 times. and failed miserably not literally that book, but a book that is about growing up and music, which is the way I think, that's what I think that book's about. And oh my gosh, it's a brilliant book, and I wish I'd written that. And I'd highly recommend people have a read of that one too.
Great note to end on.
Sorry.
Thank you, someone else. Any more questions there, Tracy?
Yeah, so Lynette's just asking if this webinar is recorded. So I'll just let you know that yes, all of the webinars are recorded, and just depending on the sound quality when we get to have a look at it tomorrow, we do pop most of them up on our City Marion YouTube channel the following week. So look out for that, Lynette. I think she joined late, so she didn't want to miss out on anything.
Sure.
And can I just mention too that you mentioned some of the great authors that have written stories in Thrill Me, Lynette, and we do actually have 3 of those amazing authors coming up with their own events on Library Through the Lens. So Catherine Argyle, the one that wrote the Things She Owned, with that beautiful shimmery cover. So she's coming up on Thursday the 4th of June at 7 o'clock. And Rachel Mead, so she's talking about her book, The Application of Pressure, on Thursday the 11th of June at 7 p.m. And I also noticed that Helen Dinmore that you were talking about is listening in tonight, and she's another award-winning children's author who's joining us under her pen name, Catherine Norton. So look out for that one on our Facebook page and website. And she's talking on the 2nd of June about her book, Family Fortune.
What an amazing lineup. You, as I said at the beginning, you and all your staff have just pivoted so quickly to get these things up and running. So I'm going to applaud you, Tracy, and the library on behalf of everyone at home who we can't hear or see.
Well, we try to be, you know, right up there on the ball. So I think we responded within about a week, got in touch with the long list of valuable contacts and wonderful publishers, etc., such as Lynette. Lynette was a great hit at our WordFest festival last year, as were yourself too, Victoria. So
Yeah.
to get in touch with the wonderful contacts that we've built up and relationships we've made over the years certainly helped make this series a big success and the envy of the local literary world out there. But yeah, it's been great, and we've got some wonderful things coming up. For example, next Tuesday, on that same thrilling story writing genre, we've got a workshop, a horror writing workshop. So if anybody's inspired by tonight to write their own thrilling, spooky stories, please join us for that one as well.
And can I just say thank you so much, Tracy and Victoria. I'll just echo what Victoria said about how incredibly fabulous the City of Marion Library is, and how you've adapted to this has been fantastic. It's keeping communities connected, which is so important at this time. So thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Victoria, for those awesome questions.
Oh, thanks, Lynette. I love the book.
Thank you.
Thank to both of you for joining us tonight. And Victoria, I really look forward to seeing what comes of your prediction of a Corona lit genre from the amazing
Corona lit. Just to end on that note, one of my sons has grown a moustache, and I'm calling it the Como.
Oh!
So I think there's a whole lot of really, really bad jokes to be made about this when we can all probably laugh again. But co-lit or Rona-lit, I don't know. We should pen something.
Oh, there's some,
it'll be interesting to see
out there in the cyber world.
Let's get up and running. What happens?
I think so. And who could, you know, if you'd said to a writer 5 years ago, create a world where in 2 months the whole place would shut down and all this would happen, I don't know if anyone could have imagined something like this. So
no, it came out of the blue, didn't it?
Yeah, we'll see what they come up with.
We will. So thanks for inspiring all the writers that have joined us tonight and all of our wonderful listeners. And Thrill Me can be purchased online from Glimmer Press, or you could pick up a copy at your local bookshops around Adelaide. One of those would be Shakespeare's Press, I would imagine. Becky was on the line with us tonight. And of course, now that you can get back into our libraries, you'll be able to pick up a copy there as well.
Thanks, Tracy.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lynette.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.